Hi, welcome back, everyone. Hope you got a little chance to stretch your legs and had a cup of coffee. I know we had a phenomenal first half. Wait till you see the second half. So without further ado, let me introduce our next moderator. She's a powerhouse who just got appointed as a general manager of blockchain, healthcare, and identity project at the Linux Foundation, an executive director at Hyperledger, where she's responsible for the full life cycle management of Hyperledger's membership community while overseeing the broader industry and business community outreach and network growth. She has developed and led growth and innovation strategies for more than 18 years, with a background working with financial services, media, and enterprise software. Let's welcome Daniela Barbosa, who's going to be moderating supply chain panel today. And over to you, Daniela.
Wonderful. Thank you, Minnie, for the introduction. I might have a lot of responsibilities and work to do, but one of my favorite things to do is sessions like this and meet everyone at events like this. So once again, welcome everyone to TiE Silicon Valley Blockchain and AI Summit panel on upgrading supply chains. As Minnie said, my name is Daniela Barbosa, and I'm the new executive director at Hyperledger, which is a global consortium of open source enterprise blockchain projects at the Linux Foundation. I have great memories of TiE Silicon Valley and meeting many of you in person at local events. And I hope that we're all on the path to making that a reality. And that video with Vegas certainly calls that we're about getting to that point where we'll see each other again. As the mainstream media news today here in the US and I'm sure abroad, supply chains are in a major need of a global upgrade. As we sit here all attending this conference virtually, ships are waiting for docks to unload their cargo, supply chains are missing critical pieces. As has become very evident at scale during the pandemic, centralized supply chain systems are not resilient in the face of sudden changes, and data is often reliable. The result is that it can take many months to fix these disruptions. There are many issues, like in the description of this session, that come up. For example, counterfeiting is on the rise, with the total value of counterfeit and pirated goods forecasted to exceed $2.3 trillion by 2022. But there are also very positive things that technologies are addressing. For example, projects that are driven in part by environmental, social, and governance goals that we see in the marketplace. As we will discuss today by our expert panel that spans across various industries and parts of the supply chain, blockchain and AI work in tandem and have the ability to rapidly increase the reliability of the supply chains that the world depends on by increasing transparency, reducing fraud, and creating a more resilient infrastructure. I, for one, want to make sure that this holiday season, my kids' presents get here too. So want to address some of those issues. Before we start into the questions and answers, I want to recommend that everyone attending today, please submit your questions via the chat. We'll go ahead and address those as we go through the session. We want to be able to answer any questions that you might have. To start off, I'd like to have each panelist take 5 minutes to introduce themselves, introduce the organization, and address some of the leading trends from your perspective around supply chain. This then will open up, like I said, for questions and audience, and maybe perhaps a few for me as a moderator. So let's go around, and Gurwinder, can you please introduce yourself, the organization you're with, your role, and some of the leading trends from your perspective, opportunities and issues?
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Minnie and Radhika, for hosting, and congratulations, particularly Daniela, to you. Glad to be reassociated with TiE as well as with TiE Silicon Valley. Thank you for inviting me over here. I'm the CEO of Digital Twin Labs and also an external advisor to the Gates Foundation on their digitization program. Previously, I was the CTO for IBM's blockchain, cloud, and IoT business, covering North America clients, and also was privileged to be nominated as a member of the IBM Academy of Technology. Around 2013, 2014, and this will give you a little perspective on my entry point into blockchain, I was privileged enough to co-create the first proof of blockchain use in enterprises in the world, which created a lot of buzz and eventually culminated into the formation of the IBM blockchain business unit. And Daniela, thanks to the legacy that you've carried, also culminated into the formation of the Linux Foundation Hyperledger project. So since then, for me, that journey has continued in my current venture at Digital Twin Labs, where we create strategy and build platforms for clients inspired by blockchain, but also inspired by IoT and increasingly by AI and machine learning. I'm a fairly deep expert in at least the first two areas, and a learning student in the machine learning area. So more to the supply chain point, my supply chain work has been in the global trade of diamonds and multimodal shipping containers. So the example that you just cited of ships waiting at the port in California and other places really rings home. And other areas of supply chain and blockchain are in food, in micronutrition with the Gates Foundation, and increasingly at the intersection, I might add, of trade finance and the token economy. So I'll wrap up with leaving on the stage a bold retrospective, but then more a progression, a recap of a retrospective, but more a progression of what I see are the important lens on how we view this. So the legacy in some sense has been EDI and ERP. And if you consider that to be, T minus infinity or T minus one, basically where most supply chains are now, what we did is we put the internet on supply chains. We really did not put supply chains on the internet. And that's a very loaded, hopefully a profound statement we can unpack later. But where we are now, meaning with the entry of blockchain around, I would argue around 2016, we went into digitizing documents, not digitalizing, but specifically digitizing documents onto the blockchain. So you'll see many shipping container kind of consortia situated with those. Then if we look forward on where this is headed and where we, from our little role in moving the needle, are trying to take some of our clients into T+1 is end-to-end provenance of goods and services. And in many cases, like food provenance, that has been accomplished where you can now scan the origin and the entire traceability of an item. Instead of in 2 weeks, you can do it in like 2 minutes. And then we move into the more bold era, and that is digital assets in supply chains and in trade finance markets. And if I were to posit another guess on where the future would go after that, if autonomous vehicles are here, would autonomous ships be far behind? So we begin to look at the possibilities in the realm of possibility of autonomous kind of supply chain networks, where the implications then become very, very profound and impactful. So let me just park it over there. I welcome the discussion, learning from others, and happy to dive deeper into any of the sparks that I might have ignited. Back to you, Daniela.
I can unmute. Wonderful. Thank you. I love the not putting supply chain on the blockchain. We can certainly talk about that because it's an important concept for the audience to understand as well. Raj, Sharif, if you can go next, a little introduction, what you've been working on and some of the challenges and opportunities that you see as well with blockchain and AI, that would be fantastic.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela. My name is Raj Sharif. I'm the CEO and founder of FarmaTrust, and we essentially provide distributed ledger solutions for the pharmaceutical industry. We only specialize in the pharmaceutical industry, so we don't touch other kind of industries, although we do sometimes allow licensing of our backbone for other industries that we don't particularly want to get into. For the healthcare sector, it's, as you know, the second most regulated industry after finance. So although back in 2017, we started off looking at it very much as an altruistic endeavor in terms of eliminating counterfeit drugs and making the kind of access to pharmaceutical products much easier. What we found is, from a commercial perspective, what clients are really interested in is coordination, demand planning, and preventing parallel imports, for that matter. So there is kind of a little bit of attention. Most people do focus on the counterfeit drug sector, who sometimes there's varying levels of this. One of the kind of issues that they do have with counterfeit drugs is that they're available even in the Western markets. So, very much most people think it's an Asian or African thing, but you'll tend to find there's a lot of reports of counterfeit drugs infiltrating the supply chain, particularly here in Europe. The other issues is that now that we are moving much more into the kind of futuristic technologies, I think people are looking at how can we help increase revenues, automate processes, and keep that confidentiality and security. I think certainly on the pharmaceutical side of things, the biggest issue that you have is the ability or the need of multi-stakeholders actually cooperating with each other. Pharmaceutical companies are quite kind of paranoid about their data. They're very concerned about sharing it, and they're even more concerned about using a similar tech platform to maybe their competitors. And then you have the other tension that we tend to find in the pharmaceutical industry, which is wholesalers don't want so much transparency because that will undermine their own particular business model. So there are challenges and tensions within industries. Now, blockchains can actually solve this. As you know, there's various techniques in terms of how you hash data, how you can use zero knowledge proofs to get there. But I think the issue that they have in the pharmaceutical industry is that it's quite a conservative industry. But now I think governments are recognizing how life-threatening failures in the pharmaceutical supply chain are. And this is why now there's a much bigger discussion within the industry in terms of having localized facilities which can provide medicines in a particular geography. Many countries, including the UK, are talking about how to bring manufacturing back into their own shores rather than having these kind of far away or far-flung places doing these in a centralized fashion. And blockchain is very relevant even for that, because when you have the ability to have immutable and incorruptible data, that means you can easily check up on licensing. There are machines now, as you know, Siemens in particular, which have personalized dosage. And we're part of an effort here in the UK, which is run by the Centre for Process Innovation, which will look at how we're going to have personalized dosage for patients, so that rather than having generic medicines which you take 3 times a day, a dose is made for you as that individual based on your age, your genetic makeup, etc., etc. So what we are looking at is perhaps a fragmentation of the industry and the personalization of medicine generally, which of course is going to significantly alter the way the supply chain is managed and administered, and allowing cooperation between many of the participants. But I think the biggest issue that we have is actually the pharmaceutical industry is very slow to take on technical innovations. I mean, we tend to find it quite surprising that many kind of pharmaceutical treatments and cures are found by accident, or by, really kind of doing things in a very far-flung experimental fashion. But when it comes to technology and the use of technology, we do find the sector to be quite difficult to bring new innovations in there. In terms of kind of where do we see this going? Well, I suspect we are likely to have governments pushing more pharmaceutical companies, wholesalers and chemists coming together and cooperating with one another. And it really has to be a regulatory kind of led environment. As you know, in the US, we've took parts with the FDA pilots on blockchain, and that was for DSCSA enforcement, which is, tracking a product from the point of production to the point of consumption. And for many years, the government's tried to work with industry to get that. Blockchain works perfectly in that kind of environment. Here in the EU, we have what they call Falsified Medicines Directive. And now we have medical device directives as well, which will force a lot of these pharmaceutical supply chain participants to have to work together. But I think when they are working together, they will see the benefits. The costs will fall dramatically. We can have fast recall services. You can have predictive stock controls. You can eliminate not just shortages of medicines, but also oversupplies. And you can do that on a platform where you control who sees your data, and you have that comfort of being able to work on the same platform. We can talk about this in much length. The consumers, of course, can also benefit. There is a big kind of push, I think, we're seeing across all industries of empowering the consumer to make decisions. So you're seeing it in the food industry, of course, where there's meat production, et cetera, but increasingly, I think, even in the pharmaceutical sector, particularly when it comes to some medicines which are made from animal products, perhaps patients would prefer that they have the alternative synthetic versions for particular principles or reasons. So we can discuss this at length, but I think there is kind of a revolution coming with distributed ledger technology. I think it has been bubbling away with lots of misinformation, including money laundering and misconception in terms of data sharing, but things are going to change very rapidly, I think, in the next few years.
Right. Well, excellent.
Thank you, Danielle.
Raja, what I hear you say is the pharmaceutical is very unique, but it is not as unique as, the supply chain issues around things, automation, confidentiality, and security, which were the top three things that you talked about, still apply to other supply chains. And that an industry like the pharmaceutical industry, as regulation is required, that the technology is very, keen to actually solving these things actually move further as well. So I don't know what that was, but hope everyone's okay. Excellent. So I think coordination and demand planning was another thing that you mentioned, and Gurwinder also talked about, right, is how do we get these very often competitors in the space working together and trusting each other as part of these networks as well. Excellent. Paul Singh, over to you. Little introduction and some of your thoughts on the topic of discussion.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. I work as a CRO for TiE Cognitive, and we've been in the supply chain business for a number of years, have many successful installations all the way from Caterpillar and Navistar and others. And we've been seeing kind of this issue of supply chain being, obviously right now the issues are bubbling up everywhere. Some of our customers actually were able to weather the COVID storm very well, and they're doing pretty well because they planned for this a little while ago, rather than trying to deal with the issues right at the nick of time. So the whole core technology, that one of the things that our founders who've been in the supply chain business for 25 plus years always found is that, hey, we keep on going into and seeing the same kind of issues pop up again and again. And the issue really is, it's the lack of network. It's the lack of connectivity between different elements. And so, Gurwinder obviously is an expert in digital twin. So we took it a little bit further and we created the digital twin of the organization. So we kind of take a very different approach on the supply chain side to build the whole digital twin of the organization. And then we put the data inside it once we built the digital DNA of the organization, understand all the elements that go together. And then we built the data fabric. So we started with building a manufacturing, kind of data fabric, if you might, which we have used to build lots of solutions for companies. And then we've done the same thing now for healthcare, and we're doing it in other industries, including CPG and others. And so the idea really is, how do you make sure that these systems get connected and the people in the trenches have access to the information that they need at any time? And I think, like everybody has been talking about it, how do you really connect all these people together? And that's a big challenge, right? Trying to connect your suppliers is a big challenge. And then on top of that, having, other people in the ecosystem to be connected. And this has been a challenge. And fortunately, we have seen with a lot of our customers, it's a process. And we figured out how to solve that process for many of them. So we can do the connectivity, not just with the tier 1 suppliers, but all the way to tier 3 and 4 suppliers. And not only just your suppliers, but bring your distributors into the picture, not just your distributors, and how do you make sure that your customers can become part of it? So I think the need of the hour, if you might, I would leave you with one thought that, people talk about, future of supply chain. I think the future of supply chain really is this kind of the cognitive network, or a connected network of all these different elements together, so that when you digitize it properly, you will have that connectivity. You can have that data flow in from, hundreds of systems together. And that is something that we find has been lacking. And so once we bring that connectivity, and, a lot of times people say, oh, I have an ERP system, I have an MRP system, and so on. And, they spend years and years. And, those are like 12 months to 24 months projects when you try to connect these systems together. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people have time to do that. The need of the hour is, can you really do it fast? Can you show me value today? Mm-hmm. And because, I have to work with all the systems that are in place, but how do you connect them together to build this whole digital twin of the organization, and then insert the elements that are needed, and not always insist on that I have to do the giant system from day one, but build it incrementally. And so that's kind of what we are seeing in the marketplace. Then we are seeing the blockchain, industrial manufacturing sector is not always the first one to adopt the blockchain, but I think for asset management, it has been going on. In the CPG world, we are seeing the traction in terms of people wanting to deploy blockchain-based solution faster. So we have our partner here that we have partnered with for blockchain, Sunil, and he's going to talk a little bit more about how we have integrated blockchain into the whole supply chain business. So I'm going to leave it up to him to discuss more. So thank you.
Excellent. Excellent, Paul. So, a couple of themes that I saw there. Number one is that this is still a digital transformation story. And if, suppliers and others within the supply chain, or even the trade finance, networks don't have that digital transformation done, you can build the most beautiful blockchain network system. You're not going to be able to get in it. And, there's stories, obviously, during COVID where there weren't people to sign the papers at port to go sign off because they're, to go on to the next stage. The other thing that you talked about is that it is not one network. These networks are not just one. Interoperability is going to become, continually become an issue and a requirement in order for these networks to operate with one another. And then I love the idea of a digital twin of an organization as you think about what the next phase of digital digitalization of organizations and of these networks itself. So it's not one network to rule them all. They're going to be networks of networks. This is still a digital transformation enterprise play. One thing that Paul said, which, we hear this over and over again, is when this is all going to happen. This is enterprise software. This is complex enterprise software. Very often, like in Raja's industry, in the regulated industry, it is cross-bordered. These things take time. It's not going to be overnight. We get asked this at Hyperledger all the time. We've been at this for 6 years. it's going to be another 5 or 10 until many of these things get worked out and really get productionized and normalized. Excellent. Well, thank you, Paul. Sunil, over to you. So Paul kind of give us a hint of some of the stuff that you were going to talk about, but talk a little bit about yourself and Copperwire and some of the issues and opportunities you see.
Thank you, Daniel and Radhika and TiE for the opportunity. And thanks, Paul, for the heads up. And I've been in this blockchain space since 2016. My co-founders have been in the space since 2014. They built stable coins, got it approved by Reserve Bank of India in 2015. And I've been in the networking and security space for the last 30 years. So when we started looking at this problem and started working closely with TiE and some of their customers in the heavy industrial space, one of the things that we saw was this what we labeled this the N-tier supply chain problem or the multi-echelon supply chain problem. So one of the fundamental challenges, the people who are at the OEM level, they are dependent on tier ones for information, and tier ones don't want to expose information that is coming from tier two. Tier twos don't want to expose information from tier three and so on and so forth. So fundamentally, we have a network problem here. And like Daniela said, supply chains are really network of networks. Unfortunately, they're connected by thin threads between them. And the weakest thread can cause the whole supply chain to break. And as we've seen with, for like Suez Canal blockade and other scenarios like that, what happens is the data flow, because they are connected through these people who don't want to expose information, the data flow takes time. So if I'm like a semiconductor manufacturer in tier 5, I'm going to share some information. My tier 4 is going to be massaging out some information, adding some information. It goes to tier 3, to tier 2, and so on and so forth. By the time it gets through, it's going to take 3 months. So our ERP systems are operating with data that is 3 months old. So there's no way for us to connect the dots without having real data, and because people don't share the data. So blockchain, when we looked at technology, is a fundamental element of digital transformation. In fact, that point was clear to me when I met with Scott Stornetta, and the whole idea of using the timestamp and the document hashing and the distributed network to make sure the data cannot be tampered with. Then technology takes care of that sharing, the record, the shared ledger, and making sure nothing is tampered with. But how do you make sure the data that goes into is good, right? So this is where we have to start mirroring the business process that, let's say, USDA does, right? The certification process. We need to be at least as good as that process. But when we look at supply chains between any two pair of participants, there is a minimum 15-20% inefficiency. And that's because people are just trying to do things, making sure the other person is going to game them, right? So checking and balancing all of that stuff. So when we start sharing information on the same ledger, the first question that comes up is, I don't want my competitor to see the data. I don't want anybody to know I'm dealing with them. So we have to actually layer on enterprise class security. So we have to bring in identity, we have to bring in access control, we have to bring in encryption, key management, and we have to be able to specify who gets to see what piece of data. So that infrastructure, once it's in place, then digital twins can go to town on it. So for example, that allows TiE's digital twins to go beyond the enterprise and actually create what they call a digital duplicate across a connected supply chain. Because now they have the visibility across the whole supply chain, they can use cognitive technology to start analyzing, processing, and reporting, and all the no-code applications. You can build any kind of visibility forecasting that you can do. So we see blockchain as a transformative technology. We see application in healthcare, in pharma supply chains, in distribution, drug testing. There's a lot of different use cases, farm to fork, food scenarios, certifications. So it's a powerful technology. But we wanted to make it easy for people to use. So Copperwire's mission was to make it easy by becoming a middleware platform that integrates IoT, bringing data from different sources, from ERP sources, and becoming that trusted data fabric. Then AI can do its work looking at the historical data, knowing that nothing has changed. Now we can start doing analysis. So kind of bring this ecosystem together so collectively we are able to do things, because nobody is able to do it on their own.
Right. Thank you, Sunil. So a couple of themes there. The old, I've been saying this for, close to 5 years, the garbage in, garbage out, and with the blockchain, it's garbage forever. But I think that the very specific and topic around identity and of data and sharing that data, right? So blockchain is supposed to be, transparent and, transparency for all, and everybody gets to see everybody data. But the reality is that enterprises don't operate that way. Your examples of a tier 1 data provider and others as well. Really, there's a lot of interesting work going on as well, with digital twins and digital identity, verifiable credentials. If you think about the certification process on a lot of these supply chain manufacturing supply chains, you have to verify that the materials and even the individuals working on those products have the credentials to do so. So I think that's a very important part of these infrastructures as well. So thank you, Sunil. Pramita, last but not least, give us an introduction of yourself and kind of the work that you're doing there at Ford as relevant to our discussion today.
Thanks, Daniela, and thanks, TiE, for having me. So a quick introduction. I work at Ford within the Research and Advanced Engineering organization, and I lead a small team of engineers kind of exploring applications of IoT and blockchain for our manufacturing and supply chain space. And I also co-chair the supply chain working group of MOBI, which is short for Mobility Open Blockchain Initiative, which is an industry standard consortium that has multiple automakers, tier 1 suppliers, as well as blockchain technology partners. So what I'm going to speak today or share my experiences is mostly from what I have learned at Ford and also at MOBI. And I definitely want to say that I am truly overwhelmed and humbled to be on this panel among all these stalwart panelists. I am definitely the least blockchain educated here. I'm a learning student, and I'm really honored to be here today. So what I'm going to share may not be very new or that hasn't been shared by the panelists here today, but it would be probably more like a reinforcement of many of the things that other industries are seeing, and that's not very different from what we are experiencing in the auto industry, right? So I'll probably begin with some of the challenges or first some of the objectives of an automotive supply chain, right? And we kind of know some of them, such as increasing the provenance of our part and material, ensuring responsible sourcing and sustainability, and then of course identifying and verifying authentic parts in the field, detecting counterfeit parts, fast warranty settlement, recall notification, end of recycling. The list of use cases and objectives kind of go on and on, right? But what we have realized is the foundational capability that we need to achieve all these objectives are end-to-end traceability, right? And end-to-end traceability kind of spans across the entire life cycle of a part. It starts from sourcing the raw material, followed by creating the part and installing it into a vehicle, then its life and usage in the field, and finally, when it goes to end of life. And there are so many different stakeholders, right, at the different stages of this life cycle: the material supplier, the part manufacturer, the car manufacturer like us, the customer, the owner of the vehicle, or fleet managers, the dealership and auto repair centers, and of course, the end-of-life processors like automotive scrap yards and recyclers. And what we realized is that in order to end-to-end enable this kind of end-to-end traceability, we require a massive amount of data sharing between the stakeholders. And as all of the panelists said today, that data usually resides within what we call the silos of each organization. And for a long, long time, the auto industry has relied on third-party intermediaries to build this web of connectors, APIs, with authentication and verification, right? So what we have realized is that the solutions are standalone, and we know they don't scale very well. But besides these technical challenges, there is also the problem that data is locked up in incentivization and regulatory challenges. So first, there is that incentive problem. Why would a supplier share their inventory with an auto manufacturer unless the OEM probably could use their market power to mandate a supplier into sharing data? this approach, at least at Ford, what we called kind of the stick approach versus the carrot approach may not really work well always, right? Because especially for automotive supply chain that has multiple tiers, and you would need the sub-tiers visibility to avoid situations that we have been seeing during the COVID pandemic, right? So I was really reading a World Economic Forum article recently where they compare data as the oil that is easily extracted and refined, but cannot be transported to where it needs to go. I really like that example. It resonated with me because our automotive supply chain has some of the unique privacy requirements compared to other use cases of blockchain, such as payment, right? And we heard that from other panelists as well. So some of the use cases that kind of, really differ in their confidentiality requirements in terms of data protection regulation, antitrust laws, and classification of business secrets. So for example, if all the automotive supply chain even could be convinced to be onboarded on the same blockchain network, we have some attributes like price and volumes of product that never could be directly on blockchain or also couldn't be indirectly inferred from monitoring transactions between two parties, right? So none of the conventional B2B data sharing platforms we have today can kind of address these technical or incentive problems or the privacy challenges. And that's really where we kind of felt like blockchain is the solution, or the peer-to-peer technologies like blockchain could be that solution. Right. And from the same World Economic Forum article that I kind of came to love, I think they talk about how blockchain can enable corporations to containerize and tokenize their data, right, into shareable, tradable, and trackable assets that could be then governed by the smart contracts. And we kind of also kind of started looking into other digital assets such as NFT, and how could NFT be the controller into that digital asset to meet then regulatory compliance, trust, and transparency. And I'll wrap up with some of the things, right, that we're doing at Mobi. So we have realized that there is really no one-size-fits-all architecture for all of the automotive supply chain use cases. And that's why, like Daniela, you mentioned the verifiable credential and decentralized identifier standards. So we kind of looked at Mobi that we didn't really want to reinvent the wheels, but leverage this really awesome work and really awesome standard development going out there so that we can kind of create this verifiable credential-based network where the ledger is used for basically identities, business identities, vehicle identities, part identities, and then schema definition, right? And then the actual data could be shared on bilateral P2P layer outside of blockchain. So that kind of could be a way, a game changer, which could really address some of the anxieties that our suppliers might have about being on the same network. So I'll just stop there and really look towards comments from others.
Excellent. Well, again, data privacy and concerns about sharing that data within, the different participants in the network. I think one thing that's very important to understand that how we get out of, of these issues and create better supply chain networks is for companies like Ford, who are the manufacturers, are participating in consortiums that are building out these standards and are building out these networks. The technology is there. We all know, that the technology is there. Many of us have been using the technology, using, different DLT platforms for many, many years. Gurwinder, you could probably address that, for many of these. But the thing is that while the technology is there, a lot of the governance, a lot of the regulatory requirements, and a lot of the privacy concerns still need to be hashed out. And I think when companies like Ford and others come in as end user companies, we really can progress a little further. So thank you, Pramita, for being, a voice in the industry on that. couple of you mentioned the topic of digital twins, and I know the audience here is not a blockchain audience, so they might not know what a digital twin is. Gurwinder, I was wondering if you can just maybe define, when we talk about a digital twin, what exactly do we mean to the audience?
Thank you, Daniela. Actually, when I put forth over here our view of a digital twin, it actually is a digital triplet. So I don't want to upset those of you who look at digital twin from the way it traditionally has been understood. And Primita, particularly to the industry that you come from, manufacturing and automotive engineering, digital twin concepts have been there for decades and decades. The vision that from our little role and moving the needle, put forth on digital twin is really three aspects to it. So in some sense, it's a misnomer. Clearly the physical, secondly, the digital, but also the financial aspects. The problem right now, we are so broken in each of those. And sometimes I raise objection to this being an ongoing process of digitalization. Previously, it was digitization and then digitalization. But I think it's not going to be driven by technology. It's going to be driven really by economics, economic behavior, and finance. And those are some of the points I think Primita and a few of you were already hitting on. Daniela, you were also recapping a little bit. And it's going to be driven by, it's going to be enabled by technology. Whenever we have a blockchain discussion, it sounds like we are having a technology discussion. But we are really not having a technology discussion. We are having an incentives discussion. And, as has been popularly said in the Ethereum world, to change the world, you got to change the incentives. So if we change the incentives through digital assets, that's when we really have a chance to change the incentive sharing, the incentive instruments, as well as the governance structure, meaning shared multi-party computation governance structure, right? I mean, shared multi-party, truly multi-party governance structures, not dual principal owned blockchain platforms, which is the first era of blockchain we've seen in supply chain. But if we take it over there, I think that's where a lot of our work, from individually from our venture is focused in with our clients. Back to you, Daniela. Hope I answered that question.
Yeah, no, you did. And I think an important aspect, and we're at the close to the close of our panel today, that I want to talk about is how do the consumers, right? The incentives, there's incentives for the manufacturers, for the suppliers, for the finance, in the whole supply chain, but also on the consumer side. Paul, you talked a little bit specifically about your customers, so I'll start with you. When you think about blockchain solutions for your customers, what are some of the benefits and incentives that make them want to join these networks or create these networks? And then we'll go around with the last comment on that. What for those consumers here in the audience, like myself, I drive a Ford and I love it. Why should I care? So Paul, starting with you, and then we'll go around the panelists. Oh, you're on mute.
So I think Sunil touched on that issue a little bit when he talked about the issue of building because in the past, we've kind of always focused on just in time, only worried about tier 1 suppliers. And it is very clear that that was not the right strategy. So everybody is kind of now reinventing their supply chain to say, hey, I got to have visibility across the multi-tier. And so as soon as you start to say, I need to have the visibility, then you need to say, can I have a collaboration between them? Can I orchestrate that whole issue? So as soon as you start to do that, then comes the issues that you heard Ramila talk about in terms of security, in terms of privacy, in terms of how do I make sure that the supplier only wants to share information that they want to share. They don't want to share anything more than what should be shared. So I think that's where the role of blockchain is in sort of establishing that trust. And then the other thing in a lot of the industrial manufacturers, the issue always is of, if it's a $100,000 or $200,000 product, somebody is going to create a clone of it, which might cost only, $10,000. And so there's an issue of provenance and trying to make sure that it is the right product, it is the right thing that I have to worry about. And then I think the third issue, which is very important, is in this whole ESG area and trying to figure out, hey, how do we really dispose of these assets? And how do I track the life history of this asset as it goes through various cycles and whether it gets recycled or not, the whole issue of, doing the circular supply chains. So all of those issues are where blockchain would be a really important component.
Great. So to wrap it up, Raja and Sunil, just some quick comments on that specific question.
So one quick comment is that what we are essentially doing here, connecting your physical flow of goods and services with the information flows, with the contractual documents and the financial flows, which today happen to be across multiple systems in each enterprise, and it's an n factorial problem. So this is important establishment of trust all the way from the source to the consumer.
Great. Thank you, Sunil. Raja?
So from the pharmaceutical sector, I mean, of course, a lot of the other supply chains, things like environmental damage, whether a part is genuine or not is an important concern. But for the pharmaceutical sector, it's literally life or death. Are you going to get the vaccines? Can you get those in time, et cetera, et cetera? And those kind of issues can be solved with kind of blockchain technologies, particularly the new kind of linking or chain link systems that are coming about. I think the big thing that's happening in the pharmaceutical sector right now is you've got companies like BioNTech, who were quite small only a year ago and became very big. And I think you're going to see a lot of that happening where smaller biotechs are growing very quickly, and they're much more connected to what's going on the technological side and how they can cut costs and increase efficiencies. Just on the confidentiality part of this thing, I personally think this is overplayed, because if we go to the end state or the end vision, everything should be automated anyway. So when your stocks are falling to a certain level, you should automatically replenish those. And that, I think, when people are most worried is when humans from a competitor are seeing kind of your data. But if it is mainly triggering payments or triggering purchase orders or triggering other regulatory documents automatically, I think that is kind of much more a comfortable scenario for most commercial entities to deal with. So, and in terms of the hashing and the encryption, we all know it's there, it's available, it can be utilized. But I think some of these kind of hurdles that are being put up are rather artificial in my personal view.
For the manufacturers and the companies, hopefully not the individuals and the consumers themselves, because personal verification and confidentiality continues to be.
No. That's a completely different matter. As
I just wanted
the whole point of blockchain is to improve the state for the consumer and the end user. It's the guys in the middle that I think cause too much of a problem.
Just wanted to make it clear to the audience. It's an important and a very dear topic of mine as well. And Pramita, last words from you, and then we can wrap this up. I know we're a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Daniela. I think I should thank you for driving a Ford or wanting to drive a Ford. And I hope that if and when you look into a Ford Mach-E, which is our all-electric SUV, or the fully electrified F-150 truck, you are going to care about the battery, right? The most expensive part in the vehicle. And I think we are going to that future where you and consumers like you are going to increasingly want verifiable data about your battery, such as where did the raw material come from? Was it sourced with child labor or unethical practices, or was it sourced kind of responsibly? And also when it's serviced in the field, right, you want to know how it was serviced. And then as a used car owner, you definitely want that access to that verifiable data. So at Mobi, we often joke about we're actually with blockchain, and then as a consortium, we are, and again, if there is any Carfax employees in the audience, I apologize, it's only a joke, but we say basically, we are going to make a vehicle Carfax and put the original Carfax out of business. So that's really kind of my parting thoughts.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists and Radhika for inviting us to TiE Silicon Valley this year. And I look forward to seeing everybody in person at the next one. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.